the Rutgers Federal Society, and the American Constitutional Society. I would like to welcome you to tonight's debate between Professor Francione and Professor Ringach, who will be debating the ethical issue of using animals in biomedical research. It makes perfect sense that we find ourselves here tonight in Rutgers School of Law, debating one of the many unresolved ethical and legal issues of our time. Rutgers has and continues to be a unique forum in which difficult topics, often discussed in a more contentious setting, can be expressed in a thoughtful and productive manner. When one considers the tenor in which most conversations are being had around us, it makes this venue and this institution that much more valuable. With that being said, I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming tonight and participating in this important debate. At this time, I'd like to have Joe Bach, the President of the Federal Society here at Rutgers, introduce tonight's moderator, the Honorable and lovely Dean Chen.
Vice Dean Ronald Chen is a graduate of Dartmouth College and of this law school, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Rutgers Law Review. Dean Chen clerked for Judge Leonard Garth of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, practiced law on Wall Street, and then joined this faculty. He served on the New Jersey Supreme Court Committee on Professional Ethics from 1996 until 2006, served on the New Jersey Law Journal editorial board from 1996 until 2006, chaired the New Jersey State Bar Association Committee on Legal Education from 2003 until 2006, and then chaired the Third Circuit Lawyers Advisory Committee from 2002 until 2003. Dean Chen has been active with the American Civil Liberties Union, having first served as a trustee on the New Jersey Affiliate Board from 1989 until 2002. In 2002, he was then elected by the National Board to serve on the ACLU National Executive Committee. Dean Chen was named Public Advocate of the State of New Jersey in 2006 and also served as a member of Governor John Corzine's cabinet. He returned to the Rutgers Law School in 2010 to serve as Vice Dean and as a distinguished clinical law professor and a Leonard I. Garth Scholar of Law. Now, Dean Chen.
Thank you very much, President Menendez, Mr. Bach. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. On behalf of Dean Farmer, who very much regrets that he couldn't be here tonight due to being somewhat under the weather, but welcome everyone to this debate here at the law school on this very timely and provocative issue of the legal and moral issues associated with use of animals in experimentation. For this tonight's discussion, we are very privileged to have two outstanding and distinguished participants. Let me introduce them in turn. First, Professor Dario Ringach is a professor of neurobiology and psychology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He did his undergraduate work and master's at the Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, and then did his PhD at NYU. Professor Ringach has lectured on various aspects of neuroscience all over the world and has published approximately 50 articles or book chapters on neuroscience. He has served on the editorial boards of Frontiers in Neuroscience, Visual Neuroscience, and Neurophysiology. He is the president and past recipient of numerous NIH grants. Professor Ringach has also become an important participant in the debate about the use of animals in experiments. And that, of course, is what brings us here tonight. So please, we all welcome Professor Ringach here to Rutgers. The second participant in this debate needs no introduction, but I will do so anyway. Professor Gary Lawrence Francione is Distinguished Professor of Law and Nicholas Katzenbach Scholar of Law and Philosophy here at the law school. After a graduate study in law and philosophy, Professor Francione clerked for Associate Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the U.S. Supreme Court and engaged in private practice at a small local law firm before entering academia. He is the author of numerous books and articles on animal rights theory. His most recent books are The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation, Animals as Persons, Essays on the Abolition of Animal Exploitation, and Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog. Professor Francione and adjunct Professor Anna Charlton started and operated the Rutgers Animal Rights Clinic from 1990 to 2000, making Rutgers the first university in the United States to have animal rights law as part of the regular academic curriculum, and the first to award students academic credit not only for classroom work but also for work on actual cases involving animal issues. Professors Francione and Charlton represented without charge individual animal advocates, grassroots animal groups, and national and international animal organizations. And they currently teach a course on human rights and animal rights. Professor Francione, of course, also teaches courses on criminal law, criminal procedure, torts, evidence, legal philosophy, and other things that make a vice team's heart beat faster. Let me just say a word about the format for tonight's debate. Both our distinguished speakers will first speak for 20 minutes, which will be followed by a rebuttal of 5 minutes each. After that, they will each have 2 rounds of questions to each other in which Professor Francione and Professor Ringach will ask a question for each other. The response will be 3 minutes, and then the original question asker will have a 1-minute rebuttal. After that, we will have 40 minutes of questions from the audience, in which I will attempt to maintain some decorum, but not too much. This is Rutgers. And then after that, we will have a delicious repast courtesy of the Federalist Society.
Vegan?
Yes, a delicious and vegan repast. I'm going to collect the signs out there. The delicious vegan food supplied by the Federalist Society, which is become a collector's item. With that, let me try to get the order correct.
He's going first.
What?
Dario's going first.
So, Professor Ringach, please.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. Can you all hear me? Yeah, well, the first thing I should say is that I wish I had such an audience for my science talks. But apparently this is obviously something that is of interest to many, so I'm glad to be here just giving you my thoughts about this. As you probably know, I'm a scientist. I'm not a philosopher nor a lawyer. And you may be asking yourself, what is a scientist doing talking about ethics in a law school? And it's a long story. Some of you may know it. But the basic reason is that I do believe that scientists have an obligation to reach out to the public and explain why the work they do is important, and why in some instances they think it's also ethical as well. So I know there's a wide range of opinions, even among the scientific community, even my own colleagues, on this particular topic. So anything I say today, you should not really read about, it's not anything else but my own personal thoughts on this, and my colleagues may have other opinions. Much of what I want to say today can be actually said in terms of moral status, and so here's a definition that I've been using. A living being is said to have moral status if we are morally obliged to give weight to its interests independent of their utility to us. The first thing about this definition is that you see that moral status is really linked to our assessment of the interests of other living beings. And this is tricky. How do you do that? How do you assess the interests of other living beings in life or freedom? It can be tricky. But for the moment, let me just, and for the sake of discussion, agree with the following. I would tend to agree with a statement like this, that both animals and humans may be considered to have interest in their well-being, freedom, and life, and thus to have moral status. So I do agree with that. I think animals are living beings of moral concern. Okay? But the key question I think that is on the table is what is the moral status of animals in relation to that of humans, to normal humans? Now, if you suppose this line represents all the range of possible positions you can have on this topic, then on one end, you may find the Cartesian view. Here, animals do not truly feel pain, they don't truly have emotions, they don't really have interests of their own, and therefore they have no moral status whatsoever. The other end of the spectrum, you'll find the animal rights view. Here, all living beings that satisfy some criterion have equal moral status. In the theory advanced by Gary, that criterion is a minimum level of sentience. So all living beings that cross that criterion, they all have the same moral status. Okay? Our consideration of all those living beings has to be equal in all respects, no matter what their hair color, number of legs, or species. Right? Anything in between, I submit to you that it can be characterized as some form of animal welfareism. Granted, these theories cover a wide range on the spectrum, but they all based on one and the same premise, and that is that the moral status of animals they do have moral status, but it's not equal to that of normal humans. Okay? I think the vast majority of the public, myself included, and many prominent philosophers would like to position themselves somewhere along the middle here, along the spectrum. And the first problem we encounter in trying to do so is that some theories will actually deny we have such an option. So, for example, Elizabeth Harman says we have no reason to posit degrees of moral status, so we can conclude that moral status is not a matter of degree, but rather on-off. A living being has moral status or lacks it. So it's either on or off. And Gary wrote, we have two choices, and only two, when it comes to the moral status of animals. It is as if we're being told is that either we agree with animal rights view, or otherwise we must be Cartesians. Now, I reject that. I reject that scenario to begin with. And in fact, if anything, it seems to me that it is the extremes that don't make sense to me. So what I want to do is actually spend a few minutes just doing that, rejecting the extremes. I'm not going to spend much time on the Cartesian view because I think the science is clear on that. So I think we all agree that the Cartesian view is incorrect. So let me tell you why I think the animal rights view is wrong. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to try to apply the theory to different scenarios and explain to you why I feel that the outcome of the theory in different scenarios actually contradicts my own moral intuitions. Okay, and that's why I have to reject that view. And once I do that, once we reject the extremes, I submit to you that anything that is left will allow for some type of animal experimentation. All the theories, yeah, to less or more or less degree, but all of them will allow some degree of animal experimentation. So the first scenario is the classic burning house scenario. I use the mouse instead of the dog, but I guess because 90% of the experiments are in mice after all. But you know the scenario, you walk into a burning house and you see two living beings, here a human and a mouse, and you have time just to save one of them before the house collapses. Which one do you save? It turns out that there's universal agreement that we'll all save the human, not the mouse. And this is, and when I say universal, it's really universal. Yeah. Peter Singer will agree with me, Tom Ryan will agree with me, and Gary will agree with me, right? We should save the human. The question is, why do we select the human, right? This is not what the theory says. The theory tells us that the moral status of that mouse and the human are exactly the same. There's no fair way to choose one over the other. If anything, what we have to do is flip a coin. But we refuse to do that. We actually all go for the human. Why? Well, Gary tries to explain this here. I better understand what's at stake for the human than I do for the dog or the mouse. But this is just a matter of my own cognitive limitation and how it plays out in these extreme circumstances. This explanation fails. Why does it fail? Well, if you understand that your cognitive biases can cloud your moral judgment, you can just ignore them. Just ignore your cognitive biases and do what's right according to the theory, and that's to flip a coin. The second reason it fails is that it seems to be carving out some conditions, some extreme circumstances here, under which the theory appears not to apply. But we're never told what these extreme circumstances are. What are those? Well, let me show you one extreme circumstance. This is Joe. Joe has a leaky heart valve. If we don't do anything, Joe dies within a year or two. This is a pig. It is a healthy pig. It turns out we have the technology to take this pig, humanely kill the pig, and yes, there's such a thing as human euthanasia. We can build an artificial valve that we can use to save Joe's life. If we do it, the pig dies and Joe lives. If we don't, the pig lives and Joe dies. In a very relevant way, we're back into the burning house scenario. We have these two ways of acting. Okay? If before we all decided it was okay to save the human and not the mouse in the burning house, why now we choose Joe over the pig? But the theory is clear on what we should do here. The theory tells us Joe must die. Why? Well, here's Peter. Peter is a normal human. Would you use Peter's heart, more precisely, to save Joe? We wouldn't do that. But the theory tells us that the moral status of Peter is the same as that of the pig. So if you're unwilling to use Peter, then you shouldn't use the pig either. And that, again, is in conflict with my moral intuition. Here's another extreme circumstance, the polio epidemic of the 50s. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you already can thank animal research for that. But let me remind you, in the 50s, there was a polio epidemic in this country. Parents were terrified to let their kids go outside in the summer. Schools were closed, parks were closed, swimming pools were closed, theaters were closed, kids were inside. This is how our hospital wards looked like, with all these iron lungs. And it was only brought under control after the development of a successful vaccine. So what did it take to actually generate this vaccine? What you see in the screen right now is a letter that Albert Sabin brought to a newspaper to actually refute the notion that animals were not really necessary to generate the vaccine. Okay? Which is a myth that actually persists until today. But in fact, many animals were used to generate the oral vaccine, and in fact, the only reason I put this up is so that you can see that you took 9,000 monkeys, 150 chimps, 133 humans, which no one cares about. And all these studies were necessary, a word that will probably come back again, to solve the many problems before a vaccine could be developed. So today, not just everyone here benefits from the polio vaccine, our children will benefit, and all future generations will benefit from the vaccine. In fact, polio is almost eradicated from the face of the planet. And it's not just polio, smallpox, we have a vaccine for that too. Diphtheria, we have a vaccine for that. Tetanus, we have a vaccine for that. Whooping cough, measles, rubella, mumps, hepatitis, influenza, rotavirus, chickenpox, HPV, meningitis. We have vaccines for all of them. Where do you think these things come from? They don't appear just out of nowhere. It represents the work of scientists working with animals and humans. Altogether, these vaccines have saved over 1 billion lives. That's a billion with a B. And it's not just vaccines. We have antibiotics, blood transfusions, anticoagulants, lung surfactants, heart transplants, insulin, breast cancer drugs, and on and on and on and on. Needless to say, animal rights theorists would not have approved any of the experiments that led to this development. Zero, none of them. And let me be clear on this. The scientific consensus is that animals are really needed to advance these fields. And this is from a poll in Nature from last month, actually. So 92% of life scientists answer that animal research is essential to the advancement of biomedical science. So that's 92%. Just compare that with 82% of scientists that believe that global warming is actually caused by humans. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. And it's not just the scientists, but medical physicians and medical organizations have statements of support of animal research, like the American Medical Association, the American Neurobiology Association, and many others. So let's assume for a second that all these scientists and physicians are, made it right. when you come to us and tell us that we shouldn't do the experiments, that we should stop, you're not only asking us to stop harming the animals, you're also asking us to condemn millions and millions and millions of humans and animals to suffering and death. And this is the problem. I think, you think you're just saving animals. Well, you're not. You have to consider the consequences of what you're asking for. And for those of us that have actually considered what you're asking for, the answer is clear. What you're asking is nothing short than a crime against humanity, as Darwin actually wrote time ago when he said, "I know that physiology cannot possibly progress except by means of experimenting on living animals, and I feel the deepest conviction that he who retards the progress of physiology commits a crime against mankind." So that's how we feel. Believe me when I say that I understand that when you come to us, you do it with the best intentions. That I understand, let me tell you, I have lots of people come to me and say you should stop. I understand that the intentions are good, but here's the problem. You're not considering what will be the cost of stopping the work. So let me go back to this issue about the interests of other living beings and really ask, turn to the question of, how do you assess the interests of other living beings in life and freedom and so on? To me, the only way we can do this, and the best way to do it, is the following. First, I think that you can say that a living being has interest if you can show that it has a cognitive ability to represent desires, beliefs, and to act according to them. Okay? I don't think we can say a car has interest, even though some philosophers actually say that you can, but I don't. And so it is, in my view, it is our understanding of animal cognition that can be used to assess the interests of other living beings and to derive from that assessment a moral status for that animal or species. So when it comes to comparing this interest in life between humans and animals, I think the difference is obvious. To me, it is. And this is sort of captured here in the cartoon. I think human life, it's not just living, it's the execution of an aspiration, a life's plan. Human life is a process that you cannot be reduced to just mere living and the satisfaction of biological needs. Humans are not content with living, they need to live well and realize their ambitions. And in fact, when humans fail to do so, even though biologically they're fine, they have biological well-being, they can easily jump off bridges or throw themselves in front of cars. And so human and animal interests in life are not relevantly similar, are not. And this is not the radical view of the scientists. Peter Singer and Tom Regan would agree with me. So when human and animal life are in conflict, a preference for one can actually be justified. And it is really because the same things are not at stake. It's really because the same things are not at stake that you actually choose the human over the mouse in the burning house scenario. It is not because there's some cognitive limitation. In fact, it's the opposite. We understand perfectly well that the same things are not at stake. And you have to admit to yourself, this is the reason we prefer the human and not the mouse. Oops. This is top one.
Did those just show up or what?
Well, one of my colleagues uses two glasses, one on top of the other, but that's so it's really because of that, because we realize that the same things are not at stake. And it is because the same things are not at stake that surgeons around the country go ahead and feel that it's morally permissible to use those big bulk replacements to save human lives. It is because the same things are not at stake that it was justified to use those monkeys to wipe the polio out of the earth. And it is because the same things are not at stake that when it comes to moving forward medical science with the goal of finding cures and therapies, and when there's no other way that we know how to do it, that the work is actually justified. So I think there's a natural resistance from many, including myself, to really accept the notions that the moral status of animals might not be the same as that of normal humans. In part, I think there's a sense of embarrassment that I share with many of you, because I think that historically we have behaved badly towards animals and the environment in general. I think there's a sense of guilt, because any statement that you say about differences in actual conditions that may be morally relevant and maybe actually taken more as an expression of human arrogance rather than what it is, which is a fact from evolutionary biology. But it seems to me that acknowledging these differences will actually help the animals. Because it's only when we realize that we are responsible for them that they will benefit from the situation. Evolution really put us in the driving wheel of the planet. It is us that screw the environment up. It is us that we should fix it. No one else. The animals will not be able to do it. Declaring equality is not going to help the animals, not at all. So finally, I know there's this notion among many activists that animal welfare doesn't do anything for the animals. I couldn't disagree more. Now, the fact that the moral status of animals is not the same as that of normal humans doesn't mean that we can use them in any way we want. Two according to, okay, 1 minute, okay. So here are some guidelines that we use when we do this work. Animal welfareism, we try to use the minimum number of animals, we try to minimize their suffering by means of anesthetics and analgesia. We use the lowest organism that we can possibly can, so we use a worm if we don't need a mouse, we use a mouse if we don't need a cat. Animal health is placed in the hands of the attending vets, not the scientists, and on and on and on. So there are these guidelines. Are they perfect? No. Can they be improved? Yes. This is where you can play a role, and animal activists actually played a role in the past in improving these guidelines and laws. So I want to close by saying that I think that's where the actual dialogue can take place. So my message to you, if you're not a welfarist, become one. It's easy, it's better for your health and that of future generations, but most important to me, it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Professor Francione. Thank you, Dean. All right. I was going to do a PowerPoint presentation, the first one that I've ever done in my entire life. But I decided to shift and not do that. I want to get through that material more quickly so I can get to the stuff that interests me more, which is some of the things you said about my theory that I will hold against him forever. All right. Let me say, there are two issues when we're talking about vivisection. One is the empirical necessity. Do we need to use animals in a particular circumstance or to get data? And then the second thing is the moral justification. Now, Dario and many people in the scientific community take the position that it's absolutely necessary to use animals to get the data. I think that we're not going to settle that question tonight. There's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of debate in the community and various communities about the issues. I just would like you to understand it is not a settled fact that we need to use animals in experiments, or that they are necessary, or that they're reliable, or that they give us good data. For example, we always say that, well, as a result of animal experiments. You know how intrusive this thing is, like 8 feet long. All right, and so we say, well, animals are, we look at particular discoveries and we say animals led to that. Well, that's complicated. When we're using animals to develop every single procedure and every single drug and everything that we do, if we're using them all the time, it's very, very hard to make statements of causal attribution. It's like saying, I use this pen every time I take an examination and I always get A's. Well, we don't know really whether there's any causal relationship between my getting an A and using the pen unless I stop using the pen. But we use animals to develop just about every procedure and every drug. So making statements of causal attribution are difficult. Secondly, there are all sorts of biological differences that make extrapolation difficult. I mean, for example, when we're giving large quantities of a substance to an animal, try to extrapolate out and see what's going to happen if humans are exposed to small quantities over a longer period of time. These extrapolation methods are anything but these scientific methods are anything but scientific. Data that's produced through animal experimentation is oftentimes unreliable. For example, you can have very different, you can have dramatic differences in toxicity tests when you use inhalation as opposed to when you use oral administration. You can have very different results. An important thing that I think the scientific community doesn't really come to grips with is the fact that there are many ways of solving health problems. We live in a world of limited resources. So we can take lots of money and we can put it into animal tests that we say are going to find a cure for AIDS. And in fact, in vivo research has produced very little, if anything, of use for AIDS. But if we took that money, you want to get rid of AIDS? Put money into safe sex, needle distribution, condom distribution, and you will cut down dramatically the number of new HIV cases. We don't want to do that because that requires a politically non-feasible solution of needle distribution, discussions about safe sex, and condom distribution. Politically, we're not going to do that. So, but there are a lot of different ways of addressing a problem. We're looking at all of these health problems. The scientific community is not doing a hell of a lot, as far as I can see, in terms of talking to us about the stuff that we're putting in our bodies. We could cut down by 70% the number of cancer cases if we didn't consume decaying flesh, mucus, and other animal products that clog our arteries, that cause all sorts of health problems for us. So there are lots of ways of solving health problems. There is this notion that there's this unitary way of doing it and that we have to do it through animal experiments. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Dario mentions there have been a lot of reliance on animals. There's been a lot of reliance on animal models. It's actually pushed us in the wrong direction. I'm reading from a book. It's an excellent book, in which Introduction to Animal Rights, in which I talk about the fact that reliance on animal models has actually pushed us in the wrong direction. Polio experiments involving monkeys falsely indicated that the virus infected only the nervous system, and this mistake, directly related to reliance on animal models, delayed the discovery of the polio vaccine. Indeed, it was research with human cell cultures that led researchers to understand that the polio vaccine virus infected non-neural tissue and that the virus could be cultivated on non-neural tissue. There are all sorts of examples. There's the thalidomide example. There's the lung cancer. They couldn't replicate lung cancer in beagles, and as a result, people kept on smoking for decades longer than they would have, even though everybody knew that cigarette smoking was not good for you. They couldn't reproduce it in beagles, so there was a question about whether or not there was a causal relationship. Same thing with asbestos. We can go through the history of science and find many examples where reliance on animal models has pushed us in the wrong direction. There's a lot of animal research. We have this tendency to think that all of it is cutting edge stuff, and it's all dealing with important human illnesses. There's an enormous amount of animal research that is just plain silly. Again, when I did Introduction to Animal Rights, I spent months reading scientific papers and reading things about sexual fetishes and quails and things like that. I mean, if that's stuff that you want to finance, then good for you. But it doesn't. I guess if you're interested in quails on that level, it's good. But there's a lot of stuff that really is just a waste of animal life, money, and common sense. And the idea that the Animal Welfare Act or any of these statutory regimes do anything to protect animals is just wrong. I think the Animal Welfare Act is not worth the paper it's written on. It doesn't apply to rats and mice, which are 90% of the animals used. It doesn't even apply to them. The NIH guidelines do, but as a general matter, I find it difficult, and I understand you saying it in good faith, and I accept that, but I don't really think that the animal welfare laws work at all. But I want to move on to my judgment, the more interesting point. That's the moral justification. Let's assume some of it's necessary. I mean, look, we would be a lot better off if we used humans in experiments, wouldn't we? I mean, you want data? You want reliable data? Use humans. We don't do it. I mean, you want to talk about necessity? You want to talk about a really compelling use of experimental resources? Use humans. But we don't. even though we get, nobody doubts that we get much better, we wouldn't have to worry about extrapolation problems, reliability problems. We get really great data. We don't do it. Why? Because it's morally wrong. Okay, now the question becomes, why is it all right to use animals? This is a very difficult question, not because the moral theory doesn't lead us in a very good direction, name in mind, but not because the moral theory isn't there, but because we're asking a question, is it all right to use animals to find cures for illnesses when we are eating them every day? Think about this for a second. We all agree with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. Everybody agrees with that. There's probably nobody in this room. Is there anybody in this room that disagrees with that? Putting aside, we may disagree about what necessity means. Is there anybody who would say, no, I think that that's not a good default position? Okay? So, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I've never met anybody who would disagree with that. Now, we could have an interesting philosophical discussion about what necessity means. But if it means anything, it means we can't inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. But yet we're killing 56 billion of them every year, not counting fish. 56 billion. We don't need to do that to be optimally healthy. I've been a vegan for almost 30 years. I'm not dead yet. But we certainly, we can discuss whether or not actually animal products are detrimental to your health. I think the empirical evidence indicates that they are. But even if you don't accept that data, those data, it's absolutely clear that they are not necessary to be optimally healthy. Nobody maintains that any longer that I'm aware of. Animal agriculture is an ecological, environmental disaster. Animal agriculture is more responsible for greenhouse gases, for example, than is all of the burning of fossil fuel for transportation. Animal agriculture is an ecological, environmental disaster. Why do we think it's all right? What's our justification for killing 56 billion animals every year for food? And the answer is, they taste good. People were all upset about Mike Vick and his fighting dogs. They were all upset. People were really, really angry about Michael Vick. Oh, this was terrible. He was a terrible guy. Yes, shouldn't have engaged in that activity. It was terrible. But what was Michael Vick doing that is any different from what the rest of us do? He likes sitting around the pit watching dogs fight. The rest of us like sitting around the summer barbecue pit, roasting the flesh of animals that have been treated every bit as badly, if not worse, than Michael Vick's dogs. So, in a sense, this is a very bizarre discussion we're having tonight, because most of us are willing, for no reason whatsoever other than the fact that they taste good, we enjoy it, we get pleasure out of it, to eat animal products that are causing us all sorts of health problems. So then if the question is, well, is it okay to use animals to find cures for the health problems? That's a sort of a no-brainer, isn't it? So that's why I think that when we think about this issue, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, how is it that we can justify exploiting animals, non-human animals, as human resources, as a general matter? Not just in the context of vivisection, although we'll certainly talk about that. Okay, as Dario mentioned, we've got people like René Descartes, who, as far as we can tell, there's conflicting stuff in Descartes. I mean, Descartes arguably thought animals weren't sentient, that they had no minds whatsoever, that that they were machines, basically. They were machines that God made, as opposed to machines that humans made, and that when they screamed, when you cut into them, that was just like a machine that didn't have oil. They had no feelings because they didn't have souls and they weren't conscious, etc. Descartes is somewhat unusual in terms of the history of philosophy. There are very few people who really believe that. I'm not sure Descartes believed it. By and large, you have two reasons which are given. One is spiritual inferiority. That is, we're better than animals because we're made in God's image. We have souls, they don't have souls. The other primary reason which is given throughout history, and that we heard tonight from Dario, is this idea that we are exceptional. We are better. We have greater intelligence. We have life plans. We have this, we have that. It's human exceptionalism. This idea that we are exceptional, so it's all right. We have minds which are different from theirs. Our minds are superior to their minds, so that it's all right to use them. I suggest that is a position that just can't be defended. Whatever characteristic, I mean, putting aside the fact that people like Darwin said that the differences between humans and non-humans were not qualitative differences, they were quantitative differences. So that whatever characteristic you thought was special in humans, you could find in non-humans. But you know what? Put Darwin's. Let's assume that there are qualitative differences, and there may be in the way between the way humans think and the way non-humans think, because we use language, we use symbolic communication. Our concepts are linked to symbolic communication. So the way we think is probably different from the way that animals who don't use symbolic communication think. So what? So what? What moral cash value does that have? And I would suggest it has none. I mean, let's take the common characteristic which is used by people like Peter Singer, Tom Reagan to a lesser, but to some degree, is this notion of self-awareness. We're self-aware, and they're not self-aware. First of all, I think that that's wrong. I mean, they're clearly self-aware. Are they self-aware in the way that we are self-aware, in terms of thinking about the past and thinking about the future and whatnot? I mean, I do think that they think about the future. I do think they have memories of the past. I live with 5 rescued dogs, and I watch their behavior, and it's impossible for me to understand how to explain their behavior except by saying that they must have something which is equivalent to the sorts of concepts I have, even though they're not probably the same concepts because they don't use language. So what? They're clearly self-aware, but what if they weren't? What if they just lived in an eternal present? So what? There are people who have transient global amnesia. They have no sense of the past, they have no sense of the future, they just have a sense of themselves right here now. Let's assume that is what non-human animals have. Is that relevant? The answer is, yeah, it's relevant for certain purposes. If you're going to hire a history professor, it might not be a good idea to hire somebody who is in transient global amnesia, right? I mean, because if the person doesn't have a sense of the past, sense of the future, it's not going to work well, right? But if the question is, I've got a normal human and a human with transient global amnesia, which one is it all right for me to use in a painful biomedical experiment or as a non-consenting organ donor? And the answer is, I think it's appropriate to use either of them. Indeed, I think a good argument can be made that we have even greater obligations to the vulnerable. Okay? But even if you don't buy that, don't have to buy that. I would say in that situation, do we treat them equally? No! We don't make the person who's got transient global amnesia the history professor. But that doesn't mean it's all right to use them in a painful biomedical experiment. It doesn't mean it's all right to use them as a forced organ donor. I don't care what characteristic it is that you choose. There are going to be some human beings that don't have that characteristic. There will be some human beings who have that characteristic in a lesser degree than do non-humans. So why is it all right to use them? Why is it, this is what I do not understand. This idea that, if animals are different from us, that they don't make life plans, who cares? What if you have a depressed person who doesn't really make a whole lot of life plans or sits around depressed all the time? Does that person have a lesser value? Is it all right to use that person as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? I would say not. Now, Dario talks about the burning house and the dog. Yes, I discussed that at length in a number of places, but in the introduction to animal rights, I use that as a sort of a talking point paradigm throughout the book. You're walking past the house. You see the human and the non-human in the house. Time to save only one. Now, I might, in that situation, say, look, I know that death is a harm to both the dog and the human, but I don't really understand what the harm of death is to the dog. I do understand what the harm of death is to the human, but that doesn't mean that the harm of death to the dog is any less to the dog, or that I'm entitled, or that I have any right to give different weights to those respective values. I would say in that situation, flipping a coin would be fine. I would probably, because of my own limitations, my own epistemological limitations in not understanding what death is to the dog, I might choose to save the human. So what? If I was walking past the house and there was a young person and an elderly person in the house, I might say, look, I've got time to save only one. I will save the younger person who's got his or her entire life in front of her, and as opposed to the elderly person who looks pretty old and looks like close to death anyway or whatever. I'll go ahead and save the younger person. Does that mean it's all right to use elderly people in circuses, zoos, rodeos, or biomedical experiments? And the answer is no, of course not.
And so, and then also, we, you know, when Dario gives us these pictures and says, you know, who would you choose? Who would you choose? Look, let's be honest about it. If your kid were in the hospital, and somebody else's kid was in the hospital, and there was 1 pint of blood left, and the doctor says to you, who am I going to give it to? You're going to choose your kid. You know, I mean, so what? Does that mean it's all right to use other people's children in biomedical experiments? My position is that the only justification we have for using animals, in whatever context, including but not limited to vivisection, is speciesism. That we arbitrarily assign a value to our species, just as we have arbitrarily assigned value to white people, to male people. Today's International Women's Day, great day to sort of think about the fact that throughout history we have heard these same arguments made in the context of justifying patriarchy. Males have interests which weigh more. Let's hope we don't buy that. We've heard arguments that the interests of whites matter more. Let's hope we don't buy that. The interests of straight people matter more. Let's hope we don't buy that. Why is it that we buy into this idea that we have the right to assign a lower value to other species and to use them as resources? I am not saying that you have to give them equal treatment. I'm not saying you have to give animals the right to vote, although we would probably get better results if we did. I'm not saying that you have to give them the right to vote or the right to drive cars. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying with respect to being used as a resource for humans, all sentient beings are equal. And we have no moral justification except power. The only arguments we have are power and this speciesist idea that we have, that we matter more. And the answer is, we can say that. We can say our interests matter more. We can do, art. We can do symphonies. We can, you know what? There is nobody in this room. I have a border collie that can jump over a 6-foot fence from a sitting position. I can't do that. Neither can anybody in this room. I can't swim underwater without some sort of device. I can't fly without being in an airplane. So we say these characteristics are important. They matter more. And who is it that's saying it? We are. Just as we, white people, have said whiteness is important, just as we, males, have said maleness is important, just as we, straight people, have said straightness is important. I suggest there is absolutely no difference. I suggest that speciesism is no more morally justifiable than any other form of exploitation. And I would suggest that I'm out of time, and I now have to stop. But I hope we'll get some stuff in the question and answers here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, let me get... Tons of things to respond to, but I don't know where to start. Maybe I'll start with the burning hell scenario. Is anyone here, given that we're asking questions to the audience, that actually is going to prefer the mouse over the human? Raise your hand. No one. Who here is going to prefer the mouse over the human in that burning hell scenario? I'm sorry? Depends who the human is. A normal human.
What if it's 8 alpha?
Wait. What about flipping a coin? Who will flip a coin? Well, we have one here. How many will flip coins? You will flip coin? Okay. But you can see that 90% of the people here will actually not flip coins. Honestly, if I actually ask this question to myself, if I see a kid and a mouse, who I was going to say? The answer is clear to me, and that's why I say, that conflict, that I cannot accept. And let me be clear on this. The fact that I pick the human doesn't mean that I can do whatever I want with the mouse or any other mice I find or any other animal that I find. That's not the argument. The argument is that the preference for the human is not explained by the theory. It's not. He's coming up with some other arguments where say, well, I understand what's at stake for the human and not the mouse. That's not part of the theory. If that was part of the theory, then, well, I do animal research because I know what's at stake for the human and not for the mouse. End of story. My point is that your preference for the human, it's not explained by the theory. The theory has to be rejected. So you haven't really provided an answer to that except saying that you flip the coin, and that to me it's unacceptable. If other people find it acceptable, then it's fine. I think you can have a set of beliefs that is consistent with the theory. And if you live by that set of beliefs, that's fine. You're consistent with your own theory. But I cannot live by that theory because it conflicts with my own moral intuitions. As to the science, look, if I didn't believe that the work was necessary, and I think none of my colleagues would, do the experiments either. If we didn't feel actually that experiments are necessary, we wouldn't be doing this. We don't do it for pleasure. We don't do it for convenience. We don't, it's not fun to kill a mouse. It's not fun to kill any animal, even if they're not suffering. It's not. The idea that scientists enjoy, going to the lab and killing animals is obscene. No one likes doing that work. It's not nice killing animals. So the only reason we do this is because we truly believe it's important. Okay? As to the other objections, I don't know how you can come and read again from this animal rights literature that the polio vaccine was really didn't rely on animals when I just showed a letter from Albert Sabin saying that it was. In any case, let me just say a few things about this objection to the science. Animals are not, when you say, well, animals are always used to develop these techniques and therapies. It's not true. It's animals and humans. Animals usually, set up the basic science that is needed to develop these things, but then it's tested on clinical trials on humans. So it's both animals and humans that go into developing these methods. Well, but maybe if we were to use the money to do something else, we will find alternatives. Well, I'm all for it. I'm all for searching for alternatives. We should do it, for sure. The fact that animals have moral status means that we actually are morally obliged to do that. But we can't really take everything and put it, say, well, we're going to stop doing animal research. I mean, we know, for example, that using fossil fuels is detrimental to the environment. We know that maybe if we were to stop driving for a month, we will get billions and billions of dollars that we could use to develop cars that run without fossil fuel. Why don't we do that? No, we can't stop the research, but yeah, for sure we should develop alternatives. Let me just finish with the rats and mice not being part of the Animal Welfare Act. It's true, they're not part. I, for one, wouldn't mind if they were. I can tell you for sure that you would have very little impact on how the animals are treated because of the NIH guidelines, because pretty much every institution in the country is also accredited by ALAC, which is an organization that demands that you treat the mice as if they were part of the Animal Welfare Act. So all you will get from trying to put these animals into the Animal Welfare Act is numbers, but their treatment will not change.
Isn't this fun? All right. As I understand the argument, you're saying that because the intuitions, because if we go past the burning house and we would prefer to say that our intuitions tell us that we would save the human over the animal, then you're saying vivisection is justified. But let me say this, that argument simply can't work, and I'll show you how it can't work in the following way. My intuitions would probably tell me, as a matter of fact, they would tell me, that if I were walking past the burning house and I saw a very elderly, I saw an older person and a younger person, my intuitions would tell me, save the younger person. That's what my intuitions tell me. But that doesn't mean then we can't conclude from that it's all right to use animals in biomedical experiments, or to eat them, or to whatever we're
we're talking about doing them, it simply doesn't follow, because our intuitions would be to save X, that it's all right to use Y as as part of some sort of institutionalized exploitation. That simply doesn't follow. Now, what I think there's some misunderstanding here. When I say, if I'm walking past the burning house, I might decide to save the human rather than the dog. I might flip the coin, and I think that's morally justifiable. But I think another possible scenario is I say, I don't really know what death is to the dog. That's not because the dog's life matters less. It's because I'm in a situation where I can only save one. Burning houses and lifeboats are crazy, rotten places to develop general moral theories. They really are. And so this idea that, well, I'm going past the house, I can only save one, I can't save both of them. So I'm going to save the human rather than the non-human because I figure, well, this person may have relationships, or I'm a human, I know basically what's at stake for the human in terms of death. That doesn't mean that I'm choosing, that I'm saying that the life of one matters more. I'm saying, given that I think they both value their lives and that nobody gave me the right to make any sort of judgment as to whose life matters more, all I'm saying is that I'm in a no-win situation. I can only save one. I can flip a coin, or I can say, look, I'm going to save the human, or I'm going to save the first one I get to. But that doesn't mean whatever criterion I use doesn't then justify me in using the members of the other group in biomedical experiments. There's also this notion that somehow it's a one-for-one choice, that you kill one animal, you save one human. That's just crazy. The history of biomedical research is quite clear on that billions of animals are killed, and sometimes it goes in the wrong direction, and sometimes they get some information that they consider to be useful. But I mean, the relationship between the institutionalized use of these animals and the results is actually very attenuated, and I think it's very, very speculative. Dario mentions my comments about polio. It comes from the History of Poliomyelitis, which was a book that is not written by animal rights activists. It was written by scientists, and I have the citation if you'd like it. The final point that I want to make is if scientists, I think the Animal Welfare Act is worthless. I want to repeat that. But I also want to say that the scientific community fought, and I think Dario would agree with this, it's an empirical fact. The scientific community fought tooth and nail not to have rats and mice covered under the Animal Welfare Act, and they did that for decades. As long as I've been doing this, people have been talking about rats and mice under the Animal Welfare Act. This has been a big issue for decades now. And finally, Congress, as a result of pressure from the biomedical community, basically said rats and mice aren't animals. We're trying to figure, given the generally crazy things that Congress does, I guess saying that rats and mice aren't animals, in the scheme of crazy things that they do is sort of maybe minor, but it really is crazy when you think about it, that they say, well, rats and mice are not animals covered under the Animal Welfare Act, but that is something the biomedical community fought for. So if it is also meaningless, and it really wouldn't make a difference, then you would think that the millions of dollars that they spent over the decades, perhaps even more, perhaps in the billions of dollars, to keep animals from being covered under the Animal Welfare Act, you wonder why they spent that money. The final point, actually, the point I made that was supposed to be my final point was my penultimate point. My final point is I think we really got to come back to this issue that there are alternative ways of solving problems. You want to cut new AIDS cases down, then safe sex education would be the best way to do that. Yield distribution, condom distribution. We get much more bang for the buck than we've got from in vivo research.
Both professors for that very, very stimulating discussion. We come now to part of the program in which each one will get to ask each other a question. So first, Professor Ringach will be able to ask Professor Francione a question, and Professor Francione will get 3 minutes to respond. Professor Ringach will go 1 minute for rebuttal. The first question, please make it in the form of a question. So, Professor Ringach, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So it is my understanding from your writings that one of the ways in which you're trying to help the animals is by explaining to people, is through education, trying to break this cycle of supply and demand, as you often call it. So if you can get people to become vegans, then there will be less demand for animal food, for example. But I never heard you say the same thing about the animal research and what it produces. Would you be willing, for example, to say, yeah, you shouldn't really vaccinate your kids if those vaccines were developed through animal research? The reason we do this is because there is a demand for it. For whatever reason, people want to live longer. So there's a demand for that. So the question is, would you be willing to be on record saying, yes, you should refuse any treatment that was developed with the help of animals?
Let me just understand. You're asking me whether I would personally give up?
No, I am asking you, as part of your work in activism, you're trying to educate the public to understand, to become vegan, so that you'll break this cycle of supply and demand. But I never heard you say the same thing about not vaccinating your kids or things like that.
If I don't have any human children, if I did, the last thing I would fight, I would not vaccinate them. I don't believe in vaccination. I just wouldn't say. Yeah, I mean, look, Dario, I think that as I understand your question, what I'm trying to get people to understand, what I'm trying to sort of convey to you, is that everybody in this room cares about animals, or else you wouldn't be here tonight, except for my students who were coerced. But everybody cares, and that's why we get upset when we see when we read about abuse cases like Michael Vick, etc. And so what I'm trying to get us to focus on is the fact that why do we care about that? And then the answer becomes because we all realize that unnecessary violence, unnecessary suffering, unnecessary death is a bad idea. Well, if we came to that conclusion, we would have no choice but to stop eating them, wearing them, using them. Now, I have argued that the only use of animals that we make that is not transparently frivolous is the use of animals in biomedical experiments. I mean, I think it's complicated, and I think that there's a lot of use that doesn't make much sense, and I think there are a lot of problems with using animal models in research, but I think it's at least not a transparently frivolous use of animals, whereas eating them, wearing them, using them for entertainment, sport, hunting, all that stuff, if you don't need complicated philosophy to understand that. If you accept that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, none of that stuff makes any sense whatsoever. However, with respect to biomedical experiments with animals, my view is simply this. Would I use a human being who had some severe disability, somebody who didn't really have future interests or didn't really have much of a sense of self or whatever, somebody who was severely mentally disabled, would I use that being to try to find a cure for cancer? Not on your life. And I believe that the idea, I think it's crazy to say, if we use this one person, we're going to find a cure for cancer. That's crazy. I mean, that's a crazy hypothetical. That's never going to happen, and nobody really maintains it's going to happen. But let's take it as a hypothetical. Would I kill one severely disabled child to find a cure for cancer? Absolutely not. That would be an ill-gotten gain. I don't want to live in a world in which a vulnerable being like that can be exploited in that way. And I see no difference between whatever. I mean, I don't regard these characteristics as privileged in the way that Dario does. But even if I did, the bottom line is there are humans who have less of the characteristic than some animals do. I would never use those humans in biomedical experiments. Okay.
Well, I'm just listening to you saying that you would not vaccinate your kids. Left me without words. I don't know what to say to that. As for humans being used in research, they're used all the time. All the time. Humans do volunteer to participate in research. All the time. the notion that we just do research in animals is just simply wrong. It's not just animals, but humans volunteers as well. Yes, of course, they give their consent. That's important. But let me just say, maybe here we differ again. Nothing, when I gave my talk, my 2-minute talk, never once I said that all humans, the moral status of all humans is higher than that of all animals. I never said that. And particularly, I mean, in my case, I think that that's not true. I certainly can see situations where, if you live in your house with your father that is dying from Alzheimer's and doesn't even recognize you, and you have a dog that you love and you care, and the house goes on fire, I can understand that you may decide that it's justifiable to save the dog and not your father.
Professor Francione, question?
You're walking past the burning house, you see me and a dog. My question is this. You say that you're only using animals where it's absolutely necessary. But what I'm trying to understand is this concept of necessity as it applies to moral theory. How can you, if you go to lunch and you eat a hamburger. Now you're in Los Angeles, so it would have sprouts on it or something. But you go to lunch and you have a hamburger. You're eating an animal for no reason whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I would argue it's probably harming your health. But the bottom line is you're still purchasing a product and demanding a product that results in a use of animals that I would suspect you wouldn't justify as necessary. So how is it that you can? What informs your decisions about necessity? I mean, if you don't care enough so that you're eating them, then how can anybody have confidence in your assessment that it's necessary to use them in the scientific concept? I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So let me get to. I'll speak to the science first. I think there's some confusion about when scientists say that using animals is necessary. In what way they're saying that they're necessary. There are different ways in which they're necessary. First is the fact that we might need information at the cellular level that we cannot obtain using non-invasive techniques in humans. So if you are trying to understand, for example, as many of my colleagues are trying to do, how the brain works, if you can really get down to the cellular level, you can't do it. It's the same thing trying to understand how a car works without opening the hood. You just can't do it. So in that way, yeah. But it doesn't mean that the same techniques that are used in the animals couldn't be used in humans. So in part, it's both a scientific and also an ethical issue. So the same experiments that are done in the animals could be done in the humans. And by saying that they're necessary, the animals are necessary, we are in part saying, well, we don't consider these techniques to be ethical in humans, but we do in the animals. There are many other reasons why the animals may be important scientifically. For example, some animals, when they develop, they're transparent, so like zebrafish. So if you're not trying to understand development, you can actually see pretty much everything there just by eye. If you're trying to do genetics, you use flies because they have a very short generation cycle, so you can do genetics. You couldn't do in humans because you have to wait a full generation when you did many of them, and on and on. So that's how necessity is being used. And of course, it rests on the assumption that you spent enough time trying to figure out how the same questions could be answered in humans, non-invasively, and you came up with nothing. So that's what we mean by necessity in scientific terms. But as for your question about me being vegetarian or not, I think it's a completely unrelated issue. I'll be happy to come back and talk about animals and food, but I will submit to you that I'll just say this. What you call pleasure, just for pleasure, you have to ask yourself, what this pleasure is. What is taste? Why things taste sweet or bitter? How come we evolve these senses? And the way we evolve these senses is because usually we seek foods that actually promote the well-being of the organism. That's how this evolved. So when you say, I don't think you can decouple pleasure from an organism trying to improve its well-being. But that's a whole different discussion. I'll stop here.
Well, just as I took your breath away saying I wouldn't vaccinate my children, which I would not, you have taken my breath away by saying that people choose to eat things which are good for them and to sustain their organism, because I think the standard American diet is a diet of death, actually. But I really do. I mean,
I agree with that.
Okay. First of all, I want to say that you know, when we say that we use humans in experiments, I mean, humans consent. It's a completely different situation. I mean, humans are not being confined in cages. They're not being. I mean, you know, animals are. It's not just what happens to them when they're being used in the experiment. The transportation. I mean, they're transported in trucks or airplanes or whatever. They're in strange surroundings. They're in cages. They're frightened. I mean, I've been in research labs, and I think that it's not just a matter of the suffering of the animal when the animal is used in vivisection, but rather as a general matter. Okay, now I can ask him a question. Yes.
You're not
No,
No, then comes
Oh.
One more man. Professor Ringach.
So I wanted to ask, I think we were having a discussion before about this paper that you wrote about we are all Michael Vick.
Yeah.
Of course, what it really meant is you are all Michael Vick. But in any case, do you see, that's probably, that was the right title for that paper. But my question is this: do you honestly don't see any difference whatsoever between Michael Vick abusing dogs and Albert Sabin, using these monkeys to eradicate polio from the world? There's no moral difference at all to you in your eyes.
I would say that I think that understand the context in which I wrote that essay. I was saying that Michael Vick, that we were all upset with Michael Vick, and I think that a lot of that reaction had to do with race issues and other things. But we were all upset with Michael Vick because he was imposing unnecessary suffering and death on dogs because he was fighting. And my point was that I wasn't talking about vivisection in that context. I was talking about the eating of animals, and I was saying that the animals that people eat, including the most humanely raised, the ones that you pay lots of money for, that have happy meat labels that are sponsored by PETA and HSUS and these other organizations, the most humanely raised animals are tortured. And most of them have lives and deaths that are every bit as bad, if not worse, than Michael Vick's dogs. And I'm not, please don't misunderstand me, I'm not in any way defending dog fighting. What I'm saying is that it's hard for me to understand how somebody can object to dog fighting and then go home and eat a hamburger. And so I'm just saying that I don't really see the difference, and that the fact that Michael Vick participated in it directly and we go to the store, most of us do, and buy animal products, is the difference between my killing somebody and my paying somebody else to kill that person. It's still murder. And so I don't see this morally different. Do I think that, now, as I've said, I think that the use of animals in vivisection is different from other uses because it is the only use that is not transparently frivolous. That is, there is an argument there. I think it's complicated, but there's an argument that it is not being done for the frivolous reason of taste satisfaction or pleasure or amusement or convenience or whatever. It is being done with a, quote, higher goal in mind. I just don't think it can be morally justified, and I actually was somewhat surprised. No, I take that back. I was astounded to hear you say that if your father, if it were a question of your healthy dog or your father with Alzheimer's, because then I would say, well, look, you do primate research. There are human beings, lots of them, who don't have the same faculties as healthy primates. Lots of human beings who have severe deficits. So on your theory, that would then allow us to use those beings for experimentation, and that I find to be deeply troubling. But the bottom line is that the Michael Vick essay that I wrote was in the context of eating animals, but the general argument is that there is no characteristic. I want to come back to this. There's no whatever special characteristic we think we have and they don't have. Some group of us don't have that characteristic, or we have it to a lesser degree than they do. And yet we would never use those human beings in institutionalized exploitation. Why is it okay to do animals?
Yeah, I just want to clarify one point here. I don't think moral status depends exclusively on the intrinsic properties of an individual. So the way I see things, special relations matter. So if you have, a cognitively disabled human being, but that has a mother and a father and family, now of course you're not allowed to use those subjects in research because you're going to cause damage not just to the child but to the family as well.
The Rutgers Federal Society and the American Constitution Society, I would like to welcome you to tonight's debate between Professor Francione and Professor Ringach, who will be debating the ethical issue of using animals in biomedical research. It makes perfect sense that we find ourselves here tonight in Rutgers School of Law, debating one of the many unresolved ethical and legal issues of our time. Rutgers has and continues to be a unique forum in which difficult topics, often discussed in a more contentious setting, can be expressed in a thoughtful and productive manner. When one considers the tenor in which most conversations are being had around us, it makes this venue and this institution that much more valuable. With that being said, I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming tonight and participating in this important debate. At this time, I'd like to have Joe Bach, the president of the Federal Society here at Rutgers, introduce tonight's moderator, the Honorable and lovely Dean Chen.
Vice Dean Ronald Chen is a graduate of Dartmouth College and of this law school, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Rutgers Law Review. Dean Chen clerked for Judge Leonard Garth of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, practiced law on Wall Street, and then joined this faculty. He served on the New Jersey Supreme Court Committee on Professional Ethics from 1996 until 2006, served on the New Jersey Law Journal editorial board from 1996 until 2006, chaired the New Jersey State Bar Association Committee on Legal Education from 2003 until 2006, and then chaired the Third Circuit Lawyers Advisory Committee from 2002 until 2003. Dean Chen has been active with the American Civil Liberties Union, having first served as a trustee on the New Jersey Affiliate Board from 1989 until 2002. In 2002, he was then elected by the National Board to serve on the ACLU National Executive Committee. Dean Chen was named Public Advocate of the State of New Jersey in 2006 and also served as a member of Governor John Corzine's cabinet. He returned to the Rutgers Law School in 2010 to serve as Vice Dean and as a distinguished clinical law professor and a Leonard I. Garth Scholar of Law. Now, Dean Chen.
Thank you very much, President Menendez, Mr. Bach. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. On behalf of Dean Farmer, who very much regrets that he couldn't be here tonight due to being somewhat under the weather, but welcome everyone to this debate here at the law school on this very timely and provocative issue of the legal and moral issues associated with use of animals in experimentation. For this tonight's discussion, we are very privileged to have two outstanding and distinguished participants. Let me introduce them in turn. First, Professor Dario Ringach is a professor of neurobiology and psychology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He started and operated the Rutgers Animal Rights Clinic from 1990 to 2000, making Rutgers the first university in the United States to have animal rights law as part of the regular academic curriculum, and the first to award students academic credit not only for classroom work but also for work on actual cases involving animal issues. Professors Francione and Troughton represented without charge individual animal advocates, grassroots animal groups, and national and international animal organizations. And they currently teach a course on human rights and animal rights. Professor Francione, of course, also teaches courses on criminal law, criminal procedure, torts, evidence, legal philosophy, and other things that make a vice dean's heart beat faster. Let me just say a word about the format for tonight's debate. Both our distinguished speakers will first speak for 20 minutes, which will be followed by a rebuttal of 5 minutes each. After that, they will each have 2 rounds of questions to each other, in which Professor Francione and Professor Ringach will ask a question for each other. The response will be 3 minutes, and then the original question asker will have a 1-minute rebuttal. After that, we will have 40 minutes of questions from the audience, in which I will attempt to maintain some decorum, but not too much. This is Rutgers. And then after that, we will have a delicious repast courtesy of the Federalist Society.
Vegan.
Yes, a delicious and vegan repast. I'm going to collect the signs out there, the delicious vegan food supplied by the Federal Society, which is become a collector's item. With that, let me try to get the order correct.
He's going first.
What?
Dario's going first.
So, Professor Ringach, please.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. Can you all hear me? Yeah, well, the first thing I should say is that I wish I had such an audience for my science talks. But apparently this is obviously something that is of interest to many, so I'm glad to be here just giving you my thoughts about this. As you probably know, I'm a scientist. I'm not a philosopher nor a lawyer. And you may be asking yourself, what is a scientist doing talking about ethics in a law school? And it's a long story, some of you may know it, but the basic reason is that I do believe that scientists have an obligation to reach out to the public and explain why the work they do is important, and why in some instances they think it's also ethical as well. So I know there's a wide range of opinions, even among the scientific community, even my own colleagues, on this particular topic. So anything I say today, you should not really read about, it's not anything else but my own personal thoughts on this.
Undergraduate work and master's at the Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, and then did his PhD at NYU. Professor Ringach has lectured on various aspects of neuroscience all over the world and has published approximately 50 articles or book chapters on neuroscience. He has served on the editorial boards of Frontiers in Neuroscience, Visual Neuroscience, and Neurophysiology. He is the president and past recipient of numerous NIH grants. Professor Ringach has also become an important participant in the debate about the use of animals in experiments. And that, of course, is what brings us here tonight. So please, we all welcome Professor Ringach here to Rutgers. The second participant in this debate needs no introduction, but I will do so anyway. Professor Gary Lawrence Francione is Distinguished Professor of Law and Nicholas Katzenbach Scholar of Law and Philosophy here at the law school. After a graduate study in law and philosophy, Professor Francione clerked for Associate Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the U.S. Supreme Court and engaged in private practice at a small local law firm before entering academia. He is the author of numerous books and articles on animal rights theory. His most recent books are The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation, Animals as Persons, Essays on the Abolition of Animal Exploitation, and Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog. Professor Francione and Adjunct Professor Anna Charlton